Welcome to Our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law Section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to a very special edition of Our Curious Amalgam. I'm Alicia Downey. The annual spring meeting of the ABA Antitrust Law Section is the premier event of the antitrust and consumer protection law world. At the 2023 meeting, the Our Curious Amalgam team recorded interviews with more than a dozen leaders of competition agencies from all over the world. We asked each of them about their current enforcement priorities, what enforcement trends they see on the horizon, and tips for practitioners representing parties under investigation. We also got to know our guests a little bit better on a personal level. The title of today's episode is What's Happening in Austria, Switzerland, and Lithuania? Conversations with competition law enforcers at the 2023 spring meeting. In the next half hour, we'll bring you interviews that my co-hosts Honora Wong, Sergei Zaslavsky, and Jenny Mayer conducted with the leaders of the national competition agencies of three very different European jurisdictions. First up, Honora Wong discovers what's happening in Austria from the Austrian Competition Authority's acting director, Natalie Harsdorf-Borsch.
Hello and welcome to Our Curious Amalgam. I'm your host today, Honora Wong. As you know, we at OCA discuss all things about competition, consumer protection, and data privacy here in the United States and anywhere in the world. Today, I've got a privilege to speak with an enforcer of a jurisdiction that may not be that familiar to many of our listeners. So you're in luck today to learn about the wonderful jurisdiction and the enforcer that I have the privilege to speak to, which is Dr. Natalie Harsdorf-Borsch. And may I call you Natalie throughout the show?
Sure, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so Natalie has been the acting director general of the Austrian Federal Competition Authority, or AFCA, who has held the position on an interim basis in accordance with the applicable law since December 2021. Natalie has been with the agency since 2009, and when she does have spare time, which is very rare that she can teach competition law in Vienna, Innsbruck. So we're very lucky to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Natalie, so before we go to the several questions that we're really interested in learning about your agency, so could you give us a high-level introduction of your agency and what does the agency do?
So the Austrian agency was founded in 2002, so rather recent for a European competition authority. We have a fully judicial system, so the Austrian enforcement system is probably the closest to the US system in all over Europe, so that's an interesting fact to know. We enforce the competition rules, we have merger control, antitrust law, fighting cartels, and
digital market as well?
Of course, we have had some cases, abuse of dominance cases. I have the honor and pleasure to have been elected into the high-level group of the Digital Markets Act as a representative of the European Competition Network. So I'm looking forward to that new role as well.
Yeah, very good to know. So what is your agency's top enforcement priority, I guess, for the next year?
So we have some major cartel cases ongoing, partly already before the cartel court. Construction sector, very big, thousands of tenders. I'm looking forward to really push these investigations forward. So I want to bring most of the companies to the court this year. Mm-hmm. That's a big job. We have major cartel investigations in the waste management sector.
So construction and waste management, I guess.
Yes.
Because I have been doing this interview, with other enforcers around. It's very interesting to observe what's the cartel that they are actively enforcing against. And then it's always a different industry, and it's good to know. So what is the most important trend that you see developing in competition law enforcement in the near term? It could be about Austria or, anywhere in the world.
Was certainly a recurring topic also at the OECD or the UN and other fora. And as you probably know, I'm the elected coordinator for the OECD Competition Committee towards UNCTAD. So I get to take part in these policy discussions. is the question of the interplay between the Green Deal, sustainability, and competition law. And I think Austria is here already at the forefront because we are the country in Europe where we've had a legislative change allowing to a certain extent out-of-market efficiencies in that area. And we just produced some guidelines. They're also available in English. So I think on this top-notch topic, we're already far ahead.
Yeah, that's very good to know. Any observation of law enforcement trending, I guess, elsewhere in the world that you find interesting or notable?
I think, of course, we have to stay on top of technology. So I managed to increase our budget together with the ministries this year by almost a third, and will invest a lot in pushing forward our digital knowledge in the agency and our infrastructure and forensics. And I think we need to stay on top of technology as enforcers, definitely.
Any advice that you have for practitioners who may appear, before your agency or even before you?
Well, as I said before, we certainly have some specificities in the Austrian legal system, since our enforcement model follows more the American model than the administrative model that is common in Europe. So that's something you need to know and work with if you work in our jurisdiction or notify. We have a lot of guidance available also in English on our website, for example, where you can ask us questions whether you have to notify a merger or not. So just follow those procedures.
Yeah.
I think we're very transparent. So just do your reading and research, and I think then we're a very transparent jurisdiction.
I guess I have two follow-up questions. One is you said Austria is different than some other jurisdictions or countries in the EU in the sense that Austria is closer to the US model dealing with competition law. Is that also true for other legal areas outside of competition law?
I would say it's a specificity of competition law that the agency is set up in a prosecutorial way. So we prosecute the cases, but then we have the specialized cartel court which decides on the cases. Mm-hmm. So our agency is basically built up and structured like a prosecutor's office, and that is not common in Europe. Right.
And you mentioned before the Austrian competition law regime, I guess, was set up relatively recently. I guess that's probably a reason that there's some institutional design behind it, right? You get to not learn, to observe what other jurisdictions are doing. So what's your take on Austria choosing to be closer to the U.S. prosecutory system rather than the rest of the EU?
Well, a due process has a particularly high value within our jurisdiction, and so I think that model was chosen just to have a very clear division of powers between the agency and the courts, and it has been working very well. We have very good judges, and we work well with the judges.
I see. I think there are people who are interested in knowing what your agency is doing, and there are some questions asked about, do you have any thought on whether competition law should be used to combat inflation? What's your take on that?
So I'm being asked that question a lot, also by parliamentarians and journalists, and I think quite naturally what we do as competition agencies has a positive effect on prices for the consumers. So everything we do has a relevance for the consumers, but competition law enforcement agencies and their instruments, of course, they're not targeted to have a short-term effect on inflation, but what we do contributes to coming over this economic crisis that we also partly have in Europe, and we have two big sector inquiries ongoing, in the food sector one, the other one in the energy markets, two markets that have high relevance for companies, the economy as a whole, and the consumers. So I think in that sense we contribute a lot at the moment.
Right.
And we're pretty much ahead.
Is it fair to say, so your agency is enforcing competition law, which, then promotes competition and let the market do its marketing thing, and then naturally, I guess, inflation would, return to its natural level? Is that the logic?
I think competition law enforcement contributes to some extent, but of course other policy instruments have a more maybe direct effect on inflation. That's clear.
That's exactly right. So I guess one more thing I think people are really interested in knowing is that, how do you manage to bring, I heard, tripled, the amount of caseload since you have taken over. Caseload, I meant cases that you brought to courts and also investigations all included.
Yeah, I'm very proud that we're outmatching all numbers and statistics of the past 20 years, and I'm very proud of my team for what they do every day.
Yeah.
And I guess we're really committed to what we're doing.
Wow, still tripled. That's very impressive. So before you go, we want to have a little bit of knowledge about you personally. So do you have any interesting hobbies or accomplishments outside of competition law that you can share with us?
So what I really love doing when I have some time is sports. That's really important to me. I do CrossFit at least once a week. I go running. When I have time, I try to do some gardening.
Nice.
But usually I don't have enough time for that. And since I'm from Vienna, of course, I love ballroom dancing.
Oh, nice. Wow, it's a very healthy balance, I guess, of hobbies, right? Something like, gardening, it could be calming, and then ballroom dancing.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, until next time.
Hi, this is Sergei Zaslavsky, and today I'm talking to Dr. Laura Baudenbacher. Dr. Baudenbacher started her term as the president of the Swiss Competition Commission, COMCO, this year, and we're very happy to welcome her to our program.
It's great to be here, Sergey. Thanks for having me.
Great, thank you. Could you please tell our listeners, what is your top enforcement priority for the coming year?
So our priority will certainly continue to lie on finishing the pending investigations into abuse of dominance cases, but also cartel agreements. And a major focus will continue to lie in uncovering and prosecuting attempts at bid rigging for public contracts. This has been a major focus in previous years, and I would assume this will continue. I think we have also developed what I can confidently describe to be a unique technology for analyzing public offers to discover potential collusion. So we're trying to build on that technology and also provide it to public entities who regularly issue these tenders. And another probably focus of our authority is going to be something that concerns the revision of our law back in 2021, where the idea of relative market dominance was introduced into the Cartel Act. So the idea that if you're a company and you depend on another company for goods or services, demand or supply side, in a way that no adequate or reasonable alternatives exist, you can contact our authority and we will have a look at that. And so there is a lot of hope that this would create a lot of cases. So far, we've opened 2 investigations. We are doing what we can to wrap these up as quickly as possible, to also give sense of precedence and understanding to the market. I think what's a bit tricky for these cases is what we've heard from the market is it tends to be a little bit David versus Goliath situation. So smaller companies would have to come forward and allege that their large supplier is relatively dominant in abusing that position. So there was a lot of hope that it would create a lot of investigations. So far, that hasn't happened. We haven't had an explosion, but we are seeing more and more interest for smaller companies also to invoke these rights.
You mentioned unique technology for helping detect collusion. I'm fascinated by how technological advancements are impacting antitrust law and enforcement of antitrust law. Without revealing anything proprietary that you don't want to reveal, I'm curious, what more can you say about this unique technology?
Actually, we're quite transparent about how it works. So being a lawyer, obviously, anything that concerns numbers is going to be challenging. So I can't give you the exact details how it works, but what we figured out is that there are certain coefficients that just keep returning in tenders that have been rigged, and also the spread of the offers has a certain pattern that is recurring in all these rigged tenders. And so right now, till now, we've kind of discovered this manually, and we look at this, on a manual technology, but we're working with AI specialists to turn this into an automated tool. And we've seen quite a lot of interest also from other antitrust authorities to use this tool. And I'm got to say, I'm pretty proud of our team to have come up with that, and looking forward to how we're going to develop that.
Yeah, I imagine a lot of antitrust enforcers around the world might be interested in doing something along those lines. So gazing into the future, what do you think are the biggest trends that are relevant to Switzerland in terms of competition and consumer protection law?
Mm-hmm. So I think there's two major challenges that we're facing at the moment. First of all, following the success our authority has had in recent years in uncovering and sanctioning bid rigging cartels in the construction industry mainly, these affected industry circles have successfully lobbied members of our parliament to petition for a change in Swiss antitrust law. And this change would, if it passes, oblige our authority to prove harmful effects for vertical and horizontal hardcore cartels. This would obviously deviate from, decades of international established antitrust enforcement practices, but it would also render procedures before our authority more complicated, costly, and lengthy. On the other hand, another important development in Switzerland is that there is discussion being initiated about a revision of our antitrust authority, the way our body is built up. In the last and failed attempt back in 2012, suggestions were made to change our authority from an administrative enforcement body, as it exists in most European countries, to a judicial enforcement body akin to the United States and, in Europe, the abandoned Swedish system, because it ultimately didn't work out in Sweden. It remains to be seen what specific changes will be proposed and what will go through. But certainly for the viewers who don't know how our authority is built up, so our commission has 12 members, of which 5 are lobbyists from various commercial organizations. And so their future role in the commission remains unclear.
Yeah, very interesting. Different structure from the United States, where kind of the industry gets very direct input into the enforcement agency. Very interesting. So you were in private practice before you became the president of COMCO. So I think you've seen examples of advocacy from both sides, both as a practitioner and now somebody who's an enforcer. Mm-hmm. What advice would you give to lawyers who advocate before your agency on how to do it effectively?
I'd say first and foremost, have a look at our website. It's very transparent. A lot of information is available. We are generally very open about our inner workings. So even internal working documents, as far as we can share them, are all available online. Also in English, also in German, French, and Italian. And I'd say, probably as most authorities and courts, we generally appreciate when advisors are structured, when they're concise, and as far as their clients' rights allow, where they try to cooperate in accelerating proceedings.
Certainly makes sense. Good advice, I think, for any lawyer, regardless of which agency or tribunal they're advocating before. One final question. We like to give our listeners a chance to get to know the guest better as a person, not just as an antitrust authority. Mm-hmm. So with that in mind, what are some of the interesting hobbies or accomplishments that you have outside of competition law?
Well, one of my passions, in case you didn't notice, is collecting contemporary jewelry. Oh. And also Japanese fashion. So I'm really looking forward to discovering the avant-garde galleries here in Washington, D.C., and also the fascinating museums. On top of that, I have a wonderful family and a great circle of friends, both in Switzerland and abroad, also in the U.S. And so I'm blessed to get to travel. Wherever I get to travel, I get to meet wonderful people. And on top of that, I live probably in one of the greatest cities in the world, which is Zurich. So in the winter, I can go skiing within an hour, and in the summer, I can jump into the lake within half an hour. So
that doesn't sound so bad.
Not too bad. I can't complain.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Sergey.
Well, welcome to Our Curious Amalgam today. My name is Jenny Mayer. I'm a partner at Axon, Veltrop, and Harkrider in Washington, D.C., and today I am pleased to have a conversation with Šarūnas Keserauskas, who is
correct.
the chairman of the Lithuanian Competition Council. And we're very glad to have you here in Washington at the spring meeting. Hope you've been enjoying the festivities and the panels today.
Thank you.
Well, we're so glad to have you here, and just to get to know you a little bit better. I know that you've been at the Commission for a number of years now, since April of 2011. And maybe to just get our conversation started today, curious to hear from you, what is the Competition Council's top enforcement priority for the next year?
Well, we establish priorities at the strategic and operational levels. So at the strategic level, we have several sectors that we prioritize for this year, and one of them is competition restrictions in labor markets. Then we have retail, including e-commerce, and we also have healthcare sector that includes pharma. But also we prioritize on operational level in relation to each particular investigation that we do or do not take. And there, our top priority is intervening in markets when and to the extent that that intervention ensures protection of effective competition and thus maximizes consumer welfare. So that's our guiding priority. We have certain prioritization principles, how we measure that, impact on consumer welfare, strategic significance, and our resources. Altogether, that's the basis for our work. In practical terms, what we have, if you look at our recent decision practice, is we had two infringement decisions last year, at the end of last year. One of them was against real estate agencies that agreed to share markets and not poach their employees. So that's one important sector that you prioritize, as I mentioned already. That's competition restrictions in labor markets. And another enforcement decision was in relation to pharmacies. Well, we established a cartel, and the fine that we imposed was the largest ever, more than 70 million euros. Their behavior was interesting because pharmaceutical market is notoriously highly regulated everywhere. And in this case, the ministry regulates surcharges that can be put on retail or wholesale prices. So the ministry approached the Pharmacies Association asking for information that would enable the ministry to regulate these surcharges. In response, the pharmacists got together. They agreed on the acceptable level of surcharge, on the justification of that surcharge. And because they have big influence over the decisions of the ministry, the data that they provided was basically more or less copy-pasted and became the regulated price. We took that as a cartel. So that's what we've been doing lately. Not to mention our strong enforcement in mergers, because if I look back several years now, our intervention rate in mergers is fairly high. Not because we're interventionists, I would argue, but because the nature of the mergers themselves is such that requires our interventions.
Well, that's very interesting, and very much I was looking at the website and the news that you had on those two recent cases in the pharmaceuticals and in the real estate case, because I read the press release and it seems like something that could have just as easily come here out of the United States. Just amazing kind of parallels and continuities across our two countries. Switching gears a little bit, are there either trends in Lithuanian competition practice, or as you're kind of observing across the world, what do you see as sort of one of the more important trends going on in competition law right now?
I will lower my ambitions. I will only speak about Lithuanian trends, although perhaps they are somewhat reflective of the trends going on internationally. In our jurisdiction, we we continue focusing on cartels. That's probably not a big surprise. We're not leading the way when it comes to enforcement in, for example, digital markets or sustainability. We have never had any sustainability case yet, but we are focusing on cartels. Some 5 years or more ago, we're focusing on bid rigging. Now it's just simple traditional cartels. And the other trend is, and that's been for at least 5 years now, if not longer, that I mentioned before already, it's intervention in mergers. Because of the horizontal nature of the mergers that we had and mergers between top market players, we were forced basically to intervene on several occasions, and we blocked several mergers in the last several years. We issued decisions accepting commitments in other cases. So it's been pretty active and resource demanding. And here, as a small authority, we're quite often accused by the private bar that we're not focusing on what in Europe is called effects cases or abuse of dominance that basically requires proving the effects. And my response to that is we're doing lots of effects cases, and they're called mergers.
Right. Well, that's great. In terms of then for advice that you might give to practitioners in your jurisdiction or that may be having a case before your authority, what advice would you give to those lawyers with cases before your organization in order to be effective advocates?
Where do you start? I mean, it's fairly simple in a way. And I'm talking about, and probably your question is about long-term effectiveness as opposed to effective in one single case. So if a lawyer wants to achieve long-term effectiveness before the authority, he or she has to be trusted by the authority, because trust goes a long way. And trust is not easy to earn. You have to behave professionally. You have to, of course, to defend the interests of your clients, but you do not have to identify yourself with the client. I think a good lawyer that is effective is also the one that understands that we are part of the same society, governed by the same values, of the same constitution, and therefore, as much as the lawyer has to defend the interests of the clients, the good lawyer also has to help the competition authority or the courts to arrive at the right decision. But the right decision is not necessarily the one that is, in a very narrow sense, right at this particular time for this particular lawyer or his or her client. It should be right for the society as well. So I would advise lawyers against fighting for each particular case as if it was the last fight. To be effective, you have to take a long-term view. And then, in a way, you will be rewarded.
That's right, and that's wonderful advice for all of our younger lawyer listeners here on the podcast to take your career in the long view. I think that's great advice. And perhaps to wrap up our conversation here, we'll segue over to something a little bit more fun and ask you, outside of your very important day-to-day work at the Commission, what do you like to do for fun? Do you have any hobbies?
When it comes to interesting hobbies, I have no interesting hobbies. I want to put that on the record here. I mean, I like to read books as much as any other person if I have time. Well, just recently with my godson, we went to do go-karting. I mean, that was fun. That was great fun. I love things that are related to cars and racing and so on. Is that my hobby? I would like to claim so. Realistically, it is not. There's not much time for that. But then I think race-related is something that I like reading historic books. In terms of history, my favorite period is Cold War period. Maybe because, not partly, I was born during the times of Cold War. and stories from those days, and spy stories, real or fictional. That's something that I like.
Oh, spy stories are always fun. You might find a few spies here around the spring meeting.
Who knows?
Who knows? Well, Šarūnas, thank you very much. It was wonderful to get to know you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your time here in Washington.
Thanks. I'll try.
All right. Thank you.
That's all for today's episode. Thank you to my co-hosts and to all of our distinguished guests. We're featuring interviews with many other international enforcers in past and future episodes of Our Curious Amalgam, so be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.